Let's take a look at topic 2.4, complex numbers and operations. In this video, I'm going to cover solving using square roots and adding and subtracting complex numbers. So by definition, the square root of -1 equals I, and therefore if you were to square both sides to clear the square root, I squared equals -1. So we're going to start off by solving for x. We get x squared equals -25. So to get rid of this square, I would want to take the square root of both sides. So x equals, and you would have to remember to put that plus minus square root of -25. Now typically we couldn't ever take square roots of negative numbers, but welcome our complex numbers, now we can. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to break this apart, and again, as you get more familiar with this, you will not need to do so many steps, but just to illustrate, let's see what's going on. So I can say -25 is the same as 25 times -1, and if you remember your properties of multiply underneath the radicand, so this is equivalent, square root of 25 times the square root of -1 is equivalent to the square root of -25. Well, now let's simplify. X equals plus or minus, the square root of 25 is 5. And by definition, we now know the square root of -1 is I. So we 5 times I. X squared equals -12. Again, I'm going to take the square root of both sides to get rid of the square. So I'm going to have x equals plus or minus the square root of -12. Now, 12 is not a perfect square. However, we have factors of 12 that are. So let's go ahead and factor this out. We get x equals plus minus, let's see, I'm going to think of factors of 12 that would be perfect squares. And what comes to mind is 4 times 3, because 4 is a perfect square. So I'm going to say this is the square root of 4 times the square root of 3 times the square root of -1. So now let's simplify. X equals plus or minus, the square root of 4 is 2, so we have 2 times, I can't reduce the square root of 3 anymore, so I'm going to write that as the square root of 3. And again, I know by definition the square root of -1 is I. And now let's just multiply everything together. We get x equals plus or minus, I'm going to write this as 2I times the square root of 3. Okay, now let's move on to adding and subtracting complex numbers. Really, think of that I as a variable. You're going to apply the same properties as you would if this were, say, 7x and a 9x. Treat them pretty much the same at this point. So you're going to combine like terms. I have a 4, my constant, and a -11. So I would have 4 plus a -11. Now let's go after the imaginary parts. I have a -7i and a positive 9i. So that's a -7i plus 9i. And again, I'm breaking this apart right into it. 4 plus a -11 is a -7. And that is going to be a plus -7i plus 9i, that's a positive 2i. And notice here too, if you look at the notes, we are in our standard form for complex numbers. This is a plus bi. And let's look at the next one. Now this one you really have to be careful when you have subtraction. If you just go ahead and drop the parentheses, you'd be subtracting the 2, but you wouldn't be subtracting the negative 5i. So it's always good, distribute that negative first. So here I have 6 plus 8i minus 2, negative 5i, that's a positive 5i. And now again, combine like terms, 6 and negative 2, that gets me a positive 4. And then I'm looking at 8i plus 5i, that is 13i.